Hey, I'm Frank, and in this video I'm going to show you how I made Kratos from God of War. Let's do it. So this was a huge project. Probably took me about the best part of a year to get it done. If I was to do it full time, probably would have been something more like 3 months. So the point of this video is more of a general process so that you can see it from start to finish, less of an in-depth breakdown of each individual part. Hopefully you can take something from it and apply it to your own projects. If you'd like to see any sections in more depth or you've got any questions, just shoot me a comment in the comment section or hit me up on ArtStation. Timestamps are in the description below if you want to skip through. But then other than that, enjoy. So at this point, I like to start out blocking out with Dynamesh and using clay tubes there with the out of the box clay tubes alpha, that square, because it kind of gives that muscle fibers type of finish to it. So even if it is a little bit rough to begin with, it does help to put in those hard definition lines that muscles have. But at this point, I'm just trying to get in, all the landmark areas, trying to focus more on real world anatomy more than anything than trying to follow what the character actually looks like. I think you can backtrack to more what the character looks like after you've got the anatomy down right first. So that's pretty much all I'm doing here. As you can see, exaggerating the features using things like trim dynamic, just to see where the edges are going to be falling on areas like around that where there's not a lot of fatty tissue, like around the knuckles and around the wrist joints. Mixing it up using the damn standard brush to just block out some of the fingernails. Not exactly how they're going to be, but where they're going to be eventually. And then moving to underneath the hand there, still using that damn standard brush just to block in some of those wrinkles. For the fingers, I just used cylinders and then appended it to the Dynamesh and then smoothed it out. And then, just fleshing out some of the top part of the hand there. A lot of this you won't see as it is going to be covered by the gloves, but it's just good practice as well to be able to see, to know, to follow what scale it's going to be like. If you can see like where the knuckles are and where the wrist is, it gives you a good idea when you do start sculpting it in to be like, okay, this is too far this way, or this is too big or small. So there's no wasted effort there. Moving on to the high res details, I'm using Jay Hill's skin detailing kit. You can grab it off his website or off his ArtStation. I use it for a lot of human characters. It's got everything from fine line details to the deep pores, and it's really great that you can just drag it on there. Whether you're using it for final production or just a head start, I think it's great, so I think you should go grab it. Moving on to the armor pieces. So I just started with a plane here, just slicing in using the slice tool, just trying to get some of those lines in, the polygroups of the plane. I'm going to break these off and then use them as separate pieces, do on the inverse way, and then have them as separate actual geometry pieces. I could have done this as a texture as well, but again, using this as a bit of a test case, to showcase some skills. So I actually made all those individual pieces, and then these 3 different shoulder parts are pretty much the same thing. So I just broke them off using really simple geometry with dynamic subdiv for all the straps and all the parts that go underneath the arms. It can get a little bit difficult when trying to navigate under those areas, like under the arm. So using that low res geometry makes that way easier. Just masking a section here using the back, the geometry we've already got there, masking it off and then extracting it as a single plane, and then Q-meshing polygroup all, and then giving that a little bit of thickness there. Also hit it with a bit of dynamic subdiv just to see where it sits. I usually use this method for a lot of the armor pieces. Dynamic subdiv is way easier when working with low poly, just to see what the final result's going to look like when you finally subdivide it to a high res mesh. The gloves here, just breaking them off just to show you exactly what is going on under the hood there. It was a lot of the same process as the previous parts, where it's masking off the body, extracting, zero meshing, and then dynamic subdiv. As you can see here, the belt area, just pulling these down to see all the different parts in there, but they're all low res meshes, subdivided using dynamic subdiv. Moving on to the pants, I actually used the noise maker in Zbrush to get all the details of the fabric material. I did use a lot of, a texture inside a Substance Painter to get the material for this, but you do get a lot of that height information from actually sculpting some of those details inside Zbrush using the noise maker. Moving on to the boots, just Z modeling some of the pieces, dynamic subdiv, and then subdividing actual geometry for these pants parts here so that I can sculpt some of those wrinkled details between the straps. The straps were done using curve strap snap. If you wanted to see exactly how I've done that, I wanted to keep this video pretty quick, so if you want to see a breakdown of how to do that a little bit easier, it's in another video that I've got of the axe, actually it was for this project, so check that out. Buckle for one of the bags that are sitting on the back of the belt. It's not really a piece that you're going to be seeing that much of, but I just wanted to go through and kind of challenge myself with doing it, just because it was a little bit of an intricate piece. Not so much that it was a difficult thing to do, but just so much that, there's 9 different ways you could skin this thing, so I just wanted to have a look and see what the best way of doing it was. And this is the brief kind of rundown of the way, the key points of how I did it. A bunch of different geometry and masking, deleting, and just kind of repeating. Using the stroke with lazy mouse there just to get some of that detail in. And then because it was a circle object, just setting that axis in the middle so that I could rotate them all around and get them all even. And then setting it as a separate subtool and then appending it there onto the bag. Moving on to the retopology. So when you export out of ZBrush, Maya's retopology, the quad draw is probably my favorite way to retopologize something. I only retopologized the body for this piece, as I wasn't putting it into a game engine or anything like that, and it was the highest res that I had, so I just wanted to kind of redraw the topology and have some clean a clean mesh to work with. I also ended up rigging it, so it was kind of important to have that that clean topology, especially around the arms where I needed deformation in the fingers as well. But yeah, I used quad draw in Maya to retopologize that. So you can export it as an OBJ. Make sure that you name the name of the mesh that you're bringing back into ZBrush the same name as the one that's in there. If you want to put this in, bring this back in as your new subdivision 1. So here I'm just kind of showcasing where all the UVs were that I've done, but I've exported it as the same name. Back into ZBrush, you import it with that subtool selected with the same name, new low. Yep, I recognize there, cool. And then it will now be your subdiv 1 of that mesh, and then keep all those high res details. There's heaps of different ways you could do that, projecting details and all that kind of stuff, but sometimes if this works, if you do it properly, I find it's actually pretty quick, and this way your high res mesh will also have your UVs that you've done there. Then you can export out the whole model at the resolution that you want it to be at, so you can bring it straight into Maya. So now when you've got that whole mesh in there with all your subtools, what I like to do is group everything with material colors under the same texture sets that I'm going to be using. So this body, I've obviously used UDIMs, you can see there, that's going to be one material. So in Substance Painter, that's going to be recognized as one texture set. And the same as, say, here for the shoulder pad. So I want this whole shoulder pad to be under one texture set, as you can see, all under one UV tile. I'm going to put one color on that and label it as the shoulder pad, so that when I bring that into Substance Painter, it's going to be recognized as one texture set. I like to go through and do this for all the different texture sets that I'm going to be using. So move on to the gloves. You can see I've UV'd them all under the one set, and then add on that material, call it gloves. So that when you go through all of these different pieces of geometry, by the end of it, you might have 5 or 6 different texture sets. I think I did have about 5 or 6 for this one, so that when you bring it into Substance Painter, it's just a clean list. I also like to keep the ZBrush, the Maya, and the Substance Painter hierarchy is all the same. So I do like to label everything exactly the same. So when you're iterating and jumping back and forth, you're not really getting lost about what is corresponding to what. Because when you do start jumping back, 5, 6, 7 times, getting different iterations of the texture sets out, it can get a little bit confusing. So naming is extremely helpful. Also putting things into the groups here, you can see all of the materials are set. So now I've gone through, I probably could have done this earlier when I was applying the materials, should have done it then. But going through, you can do it afterwards even if you forget to. Select all of the things of the one color, group them, name them. Make sure they correspond with the same as Zbrush, because when you bring it into Substance Painter, it's automatically going to be there. So it's going to make your life way easier. I think the body was the only mesh that I did that had a UDIM. So everything else is just on a single UV tile. I did all of them on 4K tiles just because it was an offline render. I wasn't trying to be too precious with the amount of information that I was using. And then I've also just put the beard and the brows in there as well, just as the fiber mesh geometry for baking. Get rid of all those, and then you're left there. You can see all your different texture sets and all your colors that they're corresponding to on the mesh there. So next we're moving into Substance Painter. We've brought in a low poly model here, and I'm going to be baking using the high res mesh that we've got back in ZBrush. So I'm going to grab each piece at a time. The way that I like to do it is I like to do them one by one. I decimate a texture set. So say the gloves here, for example, I'll bake the gloves as one. I'll decimate them down to 20%, export out the FBX as gloves high. I'm going to do the body as well at the same time. So I'll decimate the body. Decimating basically keeps it at the highest res with a way lower resolution mesh, but keeps you all that high res detail. It just has like a really jank topology. So then I'll go into the baker here, grab those high res files. You could do all of them at once. I usually like to do them one by one just to make sure they're all coming in okay. And then I go to the ambient occlusion, the curvature and the thickness, and crank up those secondary rays just so you get a nice clean bake under the tight little areas. Turn off all of the ones that you're not doing. If you're doing all of them at once, leave them all on, but I'm just doing those two. So I'm just keeping the body and the gloves on for now. And then that frontal distance, I usually like to drop it to 0.002 depending on your PC, if you can handle it, but I usually find it gives way better results when you drop that. So then we'll bake these out, and you can see here, high res detail is baked onto the model. No artifacts or anything behind the ears or under the chin, which is usually where I like to see a lot of those areas. I think that's from that max frontal distance. So that's a little tip there to just drop that whenever you're doing baking with the high res meshes. So just putting a flat shader on there now just to get rid of that specular to see if there was any errors. I'm going to go back through all the different texture sets, all the different folders that I have, and decimate and export the high res meshes of each texture set. So here you've got the back piece, the belt add-ons, and we're going to go through the exact same process that I did before of baking those in. There are so many different ways that you can do this section. I like to do it this way because it keeps you accountable for what you're doing instead of having to do everything at once. Then if you do make a mistake, it does make it a little bit harder to try to figure out where the mistake's coming from. So I do like to do each piece one by one. Just bring it in, check it, bake it, cool, yep, that's done. I think it probably is overkill. You don't need to be doing it that way, but just the way that I do it, and could work for you as well. So after we've decimated all of the other texture set models, the high res models, we're going to bring them in and bake all of the other ones. So we're going to turn off the body, obviously, because we've already done that. Shoulder strap, then I'm going to go through and do the belt add-ons, the pants, and the boots. And this way, like I said, you can go through and have a look at them and see exactly if they've come through and know exactly that is why there's a problem with it. Looks pretty good, and that's basically my baking process. Moving on to the texturing. So this is probably the biggest part of the whole project, I would say. I mean, the modeling obviously is important and it's difficult, but I think when you get it right, if you get this part wrong, the modeling it almost doesn't matter. So this is the kind of the cherry on top that you want to be getting right. The skin detailing, the method that I like to use, as you can kind of see there in the hierarchy from substances, I like to work from the bottom up. I do everything from a blood layer to blood breakup to skin, and then I like to paint out the skin to show the blood through. The thing with the Kratos skin is that he's basically painted all over. So it was kind of difficult to have a base of skin underneath and then the paint as well. But I think it was necessary to have the skin underneath because you do get a sense of that there is skin underneath there. You can just see here that I'm using those curvature maps that we baked to grab the thickness on the ear and on the tips of the nose. Just going through and painting the face paint on a separate layer. I do like to work non-destructively as well, which is have a material, set a mask. Everything has a mask on it, whether it's a physical painted mask or a generator. Everything has to have a mask on it in case you want to bring it back or get rid of it later. I mean, again, this is pretty a straightforward tip, but having reference, you can see there in the bottom left, like it is paramount to getting a good result in getting the accuracy, especially when you're making something that already exists. Having that reference there is, sometimes you can forget, I forget as well, that having the reference there can be very helpful. So I'm just using the stitch brush here, holding shift and then dragging through to drag those stitches on. You can see down in the bottom shelf there what the stitch brush is. It's just one that comes with Zbrush, and then I've just made a little bit of a custom stitch for it. Back to the body paint. This was another one where it was a little bit difficult. There was no straight on reference of the way that this is painted on. So I had to get a bunch of different photos to try to piece together, okay, it goes down his back and then around his arm like that. And I think that it is an important thing that even if you get it close, people will notice when it's an iconic character, whether you're doing this or any other sort of iconic character, the things that are their landmark attributes. Like, I mean, Kratos is synonymous with the paint, the red paint. So anything that's not, accurate to what the character is, it will stand out. So I think spending a little bit of time getting that exactly right. Everything from, is it hard edged? Is there hard edges on the paint, or is it slightly broken up like that? I looked through heaps of different references to try to get exactly what that paint looked like and how it was laying on his body. Just going through the scar here, the scar tissue, just layering up the purples and the reds, and then under the nipple there, I've got that darker shade just to give it a bit of breakup. Moving on to texturing some of the more detailed parts of the armor, using the curvature maps that we baked out before, just to get most of that detail in there. I was finding that it wasn't actually catching all of the areas that I wanted to. It was either filling too much or not filling enough. So what I did was I got it to a point that I was happy with, and then added a paint layer on top of it. You can see I just drag it in there just to occupy that space to where I was happy, and then add a little paint and then just fill in those little extra areas that it wasn't catching, which I think is another really good tip. Onto the gloves. I think every piece on this basically has some level of a generator of dirt or crevice dirt applied to it. So as you can see here, I've just added a brown material with no reflectivity and just a bit of breakup. So it's not an insanely detailed smart material, which is, I think, how you can bog your scene down really quickly, is using smart materials within generators over and over and over again. So things like dirt and things that it's not super important that it's going to be seen, it's just for a little bit of breakup with the texture color. I think using flat materials and then just knocking back some of the specularity and using a generator for that, your scene is going to thank you for it in the long run. I do have to give another shout out to a bit of a time saver, Massimiliano. His ArtStation, I'll link it underneath. He's got a marketplace on ArtStation where he's actually done a Kratos before as well, where he's done a lot of the smart materials for the leathers and the metals that he used on his piece. They were a massive time saver on this, and they're easily configurable. and they're just great materials. So I'll link it underneath, but definitely go check that out if you're using anything that has worn leathers and worn metals like what we're using on here. I think the theme with a lot of the texturing on this character was layering. There's a lot of the same types of materials going on here. There's a lot of leathers, there's a lot of metals. And I think what you don't want to be falling into if you do have a character that has a lot of, you know, leathers and metals, which is a common material, is to not have them repeat. Having repetitive textures immediately makes it, you know, loses you from the realism of what the character is. So breaking it up with, you know, even things like this, like the alpha, you can see there, I'm breaking it up with the 2 different shades, and then different colors, different alphas as well, is a good way to have them, is to separate things, even though they are sharing the same material. You could use the same material as a base, which is what I've done a lot in this, but just broken it up with different types of wearing and different types of shades. You can see that I'm just using that ramp generator just to break up the top and the bottom of that belt add-on piece, just changing a little bit of the color variation for the bottom half, and then just layering on different types of leathers for the top and the bottom, and where the wear and tear is, which is a great tip, I think, on any of the pieces, on any of the armor, is to, yeah, just to continue breaking up. You can see there, just using random alphas just to see what works, and then tying it all back together with another layer of material deformation on top of it all. So bringing everything in as individual subtools grouped under the same material, you can see there it's using the geometry mask. I usually like to use that instead of the ID masks. It does take a little bit of extra prep work before coming into Substance Painter, you know, having all your subtools under one material, labeling them, and then the scene is a little bit heavier, but I do find that you do get a cleaner mask when you're using the geometry, and it's not destructive. It's just, I find it much easier to use. Again, a little bit more break up there with the pants. Just trying to take some creative liberty, not that that's exactly on the character itself, but just trying to, you know, work with the realism and work with, you know, a bit of the creativity as well. Again, here using the geometry masks, applying the whole material, selecting them, and then just turning off the areas that I don't want. It's a great way to iterate and non-destructively texture an object while also using the information you've already done. So you might already have a great material that you want all through it, and you can just go into the geometry mask there and just click that you do or don't want it on a certain area. In theory, that is the same as ID masks, but I do like the idea that you can jump in and visually see which areas it's jumping to when you're visually selecting it. And I also find that like I said before, that it's a bit of a cleaner mask. I find that sometimes you do get a little bit of bleeding with the ID masks, and I think it's worth the setup. Just dropping over the top there, another grunge. So this is a case where I would be using, you know, a smart material for the dirt, because it is tying the whole thing together and it is a lot more visible. And then exporting, when you're done texturing everything, exporting out all the maps, making sure that you've selected the render engine that you're going to be going into, as that does matter, especially with the UDIMs. It works with the naming convention at the end. So if you're using Arnold and Maya, which is what we're going to be using after this, that naming convention matters. So jumping over into Maya, we're going to use the Substance Apply Workflow to Maps plugin. It's really great because it kind of takes the legwork out of needing to manually plug them all in. The plugin kind of does all the heavy lifting. For the Xgen parts of the project, I used guide curves, so I find that they're probably the easiest way to manipulate and get the right lengths. And then you can see there, I'm actually using a density mask. So over when you hit under the mask section, under density, if you hit save, it'll crack open a new dialog window that you can then paint a mask depending on white and black values on how much density you want. I did a second groom for the moustache just because it was it seemed to be a little bit differently clumped and a little bit different in direction. I just felt like it needed its own groom for that little bit extra additive control. If you do break down images of him, you can see that it does look almost like a completely separate piece in the moustache area. So I did have to break that off to have that as a separate piece. I do work on a scalp mesh for every Xgen that I do. So I just detach from the mesh that I'm on and then have a completely separate mesh to work on there. I usually do one side and then mirror it over. And if I wanted to do any type of asymmetry, I can do that afterwards just because it's a little bit extra work. You can see me here painting into the density mask and then adjusting those values, the black and white values, to let hairs go through that section and not that section. Moving on to the eyelashes. This was a little bit easier. You can change the way that Xgen generates hair when you place the guide curves. In this instance, I used to place them at the actual roots of the guides. So on the initial dialog box, when you do initially create the groom, halfway down there'll be 3 different bullet points where you can select whether you want to randomly generate it, uniformly, or at specific points. So I would recommend trying those 3 different generation methods, as they do yield pretty crazy different results. And I actually found that trialing each different one surprised me in different areas and made things a little bit easier than I thought. So moving on to the body armor hair, up until this point, all of the Xgen work that I'd done was on the character. So it was his beard, his eyebrows, his eyelashes, and his body hair. This was a completely different type of hair. It was an animal fur, which is something that I'd never actually done before. And it also meant that I couldn't utilize any of the work that I'd done on the previous Xgen groom, so I needed to start a completely new one and look up how to do animal fur. And it doesn't exactly say what animal fur it is, and I couldn't get any hints on what it was, so I did have to just look up generic animal fur and how it worked, you know, whether it was a bear or whether it was a yak or any of these types of animals that I could guess that it would have been. And just look at the characteristics of how animal fur worked. You know, the clumping, the noisiness, the specularity of the hair. I think the piece of geometry that this is on made it, I had nowhere to hide on doing it, so I needed to make sure that everything, even the edges there, you can see the way that if you were to fold a piece of animal skin with hair on it, how is it going to look? And that little corner there, you can see right in the front, the way that the fur is bending under the geometry. I thought it was a really important part to get this right, as it would have just looked like a bad cushion or something if I hadn't gotten it to bend like that. But I think it turned out pretty well. And after messing around with some of the modifiers, you can see there I ended up doing a coil, a noise, and a clumping, and just messing around with some of the attributes in all of those different modifiers. That was how I got the result of what it looks like there. And then also in the material, working with some of the specularity to try to get some of those highlights, the way that animal fur has, you know, different shades of colors on the tops as opposed to the roots. And also going with that theme with just, you know, breakup. Any type of breakup is good to add to that realism. So if I want to talk about parts that I wish I didn't do on this project, it's definitely the rigging. It was probably an unnecessary part to do, considering I could have just used Transpose Master in Zbrush, but I figured I'd kind of go all out and give it a crack. The pose that I ended up going with wasn't really too wild, so it definitely didn't need to be rigged, but going through the whole process of skinning and doing all that, I hadn't done it in years, so I figured I'd dust the cobwebs off and give that a crack. And then I got a pretty good rig out of it as well, so I suppose it wasn't all bad, but it kind of blew out the time frame of how long I wanted to have to do this project. And it also gave me the ability to have a little bit more of an intricate pose with the hands. I could have posed the fingers in Transpose Master as well, but moving around where I wanted the hand holding the axe and kind of look deving it on the fly, it was beneficial to be able to have that in the viewport of where I was rendering the final image, so that I could be seeing the way it was working. The alternative is you do it in ZBrush, you move it, you pose it, you have a look. It kind of doesn't look that great. You got to keep jumping back and forth. This way I could do it in the viewport as I was rendering. So it was kind of great to say, oh no, that doesn't work, move it a little bit this way. And I think I got a better result because of it. So just bringing in the axe that I had done. I've done this in a breakdown of this in a previous video. I'll put the link up in the top right. Just bringing that in and applying the workflow to maps. Workflow with the substance painter textures the same way that we did this. And then you can see there that I'm using the handles that I put on with the rig to pose the feet, so I can kind of do that on the fly in the viewport. It actually was really good that I did have the ability to pose the character in the viewport, because I changed it so much from the beginning. And I think even just throwing the axe in the hand, and if I was to do that in Zbrush and go, oh yeah, I'm going to throw the axe into his hand and then just bring it over, the amount of back and forthing that I did trying to get that right, as far as the way somebody looks like they're holding something, looks like they're holding something heavy, and looks like that it's aiming down. It does take a little bit of back and forth to go, oh, that doesn't look right. That still needs to be moving down. It would have taken, it probably still would have been easier, but it was a lot more helpful to just be able to do it in the viewport. After shooting off a few renders, I realized that it was kind of missing something from what I'd seen in the references, and it was a little bit more of that, I guess, realism in the body. That the body hair, I feel like it needed just like some little flyaway hairs on the shoulders and on the arms. So I didn't really want to go too overboard with this, because I mean, it is supposed to be subtle. So I tried to keep a lot of the same attributes that I had with the beard and the eyebrows and the eyelashes, and just try to dull it back massively, have the density really, really low, and have the surface area really low. And I think it was a really nice addition to it, because it's on a black background. You can kind of just catch those little edges there on the black background, and just gives it that little bit extra, which I wasn't expecting. I actually think it looks a lot better. The way that the tips of the hairs catch the light, I think it breaks up the edge nicely. So moving on to the scene itself. So this is a little bit of a behind the scenes with what I did with the lights and what I did with the HDRI. HDRI really didn't do anything. It was just kind of more of a subtlety thing. And each of the lights just have different temperatures and different intensities. Some of the more important ones were the ones that were pointing directly into the eyes to make sure that you get the highlights on those eyeballs. And these are the final renders using that lighting setup. If you want to see more of the process breakdown shots, head over to my ArtStation to check them out. So that's pretty much it. Thanks for watching if you've made it this far. And thanks to anyone who has given me some good feedback on my previous videos. It kind of just is really good motivation to make me want to keep making more. If you want to see any other videos we made, hit me up in the comments section or on ArtStation. But other than that, thanks again for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.